Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to walk through creating a landscape layer material. What that means is a material that can connect to the landscape in such a way that you can paint on different textures into different sections of the landscape. This way, we can use the landscape painting tool to paint on, let's say, a grassy area next to a sandy area or a muddy area onto the same landscape. So it's a quick way for us to rapidly prototype the look of our scene. That's enough from me. Let's hop over into Unreal and get started. All right, so here we are in Unreal with the results of my previous video in which I tried to create a English countryside hillscape based on this picture. So I want to use this picture as a reference again for the types of textures that I'm going to be bringing in. Before we actually begin painting, what we need to do is figure out which textures we want to bring in. And the reason for that is if I go to the paint tool in my landscape mode and start to paint on to the landscape, nothing happens because I have no landscape layers, I have no connection, I have no material connected to the landscape, and I have no textures connected to that material. So before we begin and start creating that material, what I want to do is to at least have a couple of textures in mind for us to think about as we start to build out that material. This is both a practical thing, because then we'll have textures in our project to be able to use, but it's also an inspiration. It's a creative thing. We can browse through a whole list of existing textures and see if anything strikes inspiration. So for this, we're going to be using Quixel. If you have your own textures that you want to use, that you've generated elsewhere, then you can by all means bring those in here instead. But for this class, I'm going to go to Window, Quixel Bridge, and make sure that I'm signed in. I am. And then go to Surfaces. So Surfaces is basically a collection of textures that have been photorealistically scanned from around the world. And there's a whole list of categories that you can browse through. So for instance, I know that if I look at my image, there's a lot of grass in this image. So I'm probably going to be using some grass textures. I can see some sort of dark green grass on the lower edges, and then light green, yellowish grass towards the tops of the hills. So I'm going to go to the grass section on the surfaces and have a look at anything that looks like it might be what I want. Under the grass section, there is also a couple of other options: wild, patchy, lawn, artificial. I think I'm going to go with wild because that seems like it's most suitable. And I'm looking for something that's really dark green, so this clover patches on grass might work. And then also something that's light green, kind of yellowish, almost patchy. Maybe something like that. Right. Okay, so that looks pretty good, this dark green uncut grass. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to download it, and then I have it in my project, and I can use it, or I can not use it. But, there's no harm, or rather, the only harm in downloading a bunch of stuff to use in your project is that your project size will get pretty large. So if you are worried about hard drive space, then probably be a little bit more careful than I'm being right now. But I'm just going to download a bunch of stuff, and then I'll have access to it in the engine. So that doesn't look like I want. All right, this is the dark green one that I thought was pretty good. And then something lighter, patchier, maybe something like this as well. So I've downloaded a couple of different grasses, and if I go back to my project, there is also a sort of sandy path that I want to create. So I think I'm going to want to use a texture for that as well. So in that case, I will go to see if there's any sort of sand. Excellent. And look through here to see if there's any sort of sand that looks like it could work in my terrain. The one thing that I will say here is be careful of something that could be a repeating discernible pattern. For an example, this dry rippled sand has one big darker area that's very noticeable as a non kind of uniform pattern. And the reason that we should look out for that sort of thing is basically when we start painting on this texture, it's going to be tiled and repeated across the terrain. And if we have a specific feature, if we have an image that has a discernible feature in it, then that feature is going to be repeated as well. And you're going to get a sort of what's called a tiling pattern, where that feature is duplicated over and over and over again. So we want to avoid that sort of thing and look for textures for our landscapes which are particularly uniform and don't have that sort of repeating texture. So something like this windswept sand would do really well because it looks kind of uniform. There's no big chunks that are different to the other chunks. So that would probably work well as a tiling repeated texture. But that's not exactly what I want. It's a little too white. I want something sandier. This might be better. I'll download it and try it. You can always try things out and remove them later. Okay, this rough cast gravel actually might work for me. I don't know. I'm just browsing around looking for inspiration. This stony bright beach might be what I'm looking for. And then ground gravel, as long as it doesn't have any discernible features. Yep, that looks pretty uniform to me. So I'll download that too. Once you've downloaded a bunch of surfaces that you want to bring into your project, then you can go down to, if you close this, and in the bottom left of the left-hand side of the screen, there is a local tab. And this is where this is your local storage where all of the things that you've downloaded live. So if I go to my surfaces, as you can see, I've got a bunch of other stuff, previous projects. You can select by shift-clicking all of the things that you've just downloaded and then hitting the Add button, which will add them to your currently open project. And you might notice that suddenly I have some new things in my project which were just added in the background. So this Add button takes these textures or these surfaces and adds them to your project. Back in our Unreal project, you'll notice that there is a new folder under content called Megascans. And if you open that up, there's surfaces. And if you open that up, there's all of the textures which you just downloaded. Each surface will come with a couple of different things. A couple of textures, depending on your export settings. In my case, it's a color texture, a normal texture, and then a sort of separate texture called ORD, or Occlusion Roughness Displacement. But we're not going to worry about that right now. The two that we are interested in are the color and the normal. And then it also comes with a material. This material was created by Quixel, and it contains these textures. So these textures are added to this material called Clover Patches. And there's a material that we can now use in our project. So we can drag it onto something in our scene, such as this cube. And then this cube now has a bunch of grass on it. Unfortunately, what we can't do is drag this material onto your landscape and hope that that would work, because the landscape requires a slightly different setup. But if you wanted to add these surfaces that you've just brought in to other parts of your scene, other assets, 3D meshes, objects that you brought in, that is how you would do that. These materials are all ready and set up for you, connected to their textures and everything. What we're going to have to do for the landscape, though, is create our own custom material that talks to the landscape and knows how the landscape is set up and how we're going to paint different sections, the different textures onto it. So let's do that. I'll close out those Megascans. Just keep in mind where those surfaces were saved. It's under Megascan surfaces and then all the different assets you've just brought in. And I'm going to create a new folder under my content called Materials. So this is where I'm going to create all of the custom materials that I create for my project. And in this folder, I'm going to right-click the content section and create material. I'm going to call this M underscore. The convention in Unreal is that you start a material name with M underscore so that it's easy just on a quick glance, what's a material, and to search for things. And I'm going to call this landscape layer. This is going to be a layered material that we can add to the landscape and then paint different sections on the landscape. All right, so if we double click on that, we'll open up a new window called the Material Editor, or the Material Graph. So this is a window where we can create our own custom materials. I'm not going to go too much into general material concepts today. There's plenty of other videos out there on that if you want to understand a little bit more about how materials in general work. For the purposes of this video, we're going to focus specifically on creating landscape materials, because those have a slightly different setup to other regular materials in Unreal. The most important thing to know is that this node, that the only one that currently exists on the graph, is the output of this material. So whatever we feed into this base color input, that's going to be the color of our material. So for instance, if I was to press 3 on my keyboard and then click somewhere on this graph, that creates this new node, which is called a vector3 node or a float3 node, and that contains 3 float values. This material graph interprets 3 numbers next to each other, so 0, 0, 0, as a color. So if I was to click on this graph and in the details panel on the left, hit this constant bar, Unreal knows that if I have a float3 in a material graph, it's probably going to mean a color. So it knows that to open up the color picker window. So if I choose, let's say, red, and then pump up the brightness of the red to full red and hit OK, and then connect that into the base color. Now the material, which is previewed on the left, is red. So let's just save that and go back into my main window, drag this new material onto the cube. The cube is now red. So this is how we can create our own materials. There's all sorts of other attributes to these materials which you can play around with. I will not go into those today because this video would go on forever. Please feel free to explore those in your own time. Now that we've created this material, let's apply it to our landscape. So for other assets, adding a material to the asset is as simple as dragging and dropping. So we could drag and drop this material onto our mannequin, and then our mannequin gets the material applied. That's not the case with the landscape. If you drag and drop the material onto the landscape, nothing really happens. What we need to do is go into, if you're in landscape mode, go into select mode and select the landscape. If you click on it, it should get an orange outline, or do the same in the outliner. And that will open up the landscape details in the right-hand side of the screen. So then if you scroll down to you might need to pull up the window a little bit. Sometimes these windows can get a little bit confusing. So I've got the outliner, and then underneath that I've got the details, and then underneath that I've got the details of the selected landscape. So in my case it's called landscape instance. And scroll further down to the landscape tab of this details panel. You'll see that there's a default physics material, streaming, distance, multiplier, and then a landscape material. So to apply the new material that you've created to this landscape, all you need to do is drag this material into this landscape material slot. And then the reddish orange material we created earlier is now applied to the whole landscape. If you wanted to, if you knew that your whole landscape was just going to be grass, you could take any of those Quixel Megascan surfaces that you brought in earlier and drag it into the landscape material. And now my whole material is grass. This is a very quick way to just get a general material onto your landscape, but it doesn't use the power of the landscape tool, because if I go back to the landscape and start to paint things, I'm still not painting anything on. So it's still a very uniform landscape. And as you can see, you get a lot of this tiling pattern throughout. So this is what I was talking about earlier, where you see repeated patterns extend off into the distance. So I'm going to add back my own material called landscape layer into the landscape material and send it back to be reddish orange. So to create a paintable landscape, let's go back into the landscape window and talk a little bit about the landscape layers. So if in this material graph, I now right click, which opens up the search window to search for all the possible nodes I could add, and type in landscape, which is land, and you get a bunch of landscape options. There's all sorts of different things connected to the landscape, but the one that I want to use is landscape layer blend. I think I also have look at that, I have a magnified. Landscape layer blend is the one that I want. Let's turn that off. So landscape layer blend allows us to, in the left-hand details panel, create a collection of layers. At the moment, the default is 0 elements, but if we start to click on this plus button, use my magnifier again, this little plus button, you'll get a new layer, and this node will get a new input. So if I click that twice more, I will now have 3 nodes, and at the moment they're called layer none, layer none, layer none. And under this details panel, I now have 3 indexes to expand. And if you expand on those indexes by pressing this little triangle on the side, this is a collection. This is basically a layer. So we now have 3 layers connected to our landscape, and each of these layers is currently called none, but that's not super helpful. So I'm going to name each of these layers something that I think is a bit more helpful. So my first layer is going to be dark grass. And when I hit enter, then now you can see in the layer blend node, layer dark grass is my first layer. And if I do the same with the second layer, light grass, then you have a second input called light grass. And the third, which is going to be called sand. So now I have 3 layers named dark grass, light grass, and sand. And I hope you can see where I'm going with this, in that as many layers as your material has, as many textures as you chose for your material, that is how many layers you create here. So each of these layers is going to correspond to a painted on area of our landscape. The way that it does that is later on we're going to start painting on different layers. And this blend node is going to blend those different layer weights together into one final output. So to get a very quick preview of what that's going to look like, I'm going to take this color node that I created earlier and duplicate it using Control D twice and change the color of each to something that matches what this layer is intended to be. So I've got let's say a dark green, and this one is sort of sandy, sandy-ish, yellowish, light green. And then something which is very ostensibly sand. Let's go with like super orange, sure. And connect each of these to its relevant node. So dark green into dark grass, light green into light grass, and then sand into sand. And then instead of sending the color directly into base color, I'm going to send the output of this layer blend into color. If you hit save, then the material will take a little bit of time to save. But then we go back to our landscape, and this looks not like I intended. It's a sort of grayish, general, unspecified color. And that's because even though the material is applied, the landscape doesn't have any layer information yet. We also haven't yet painted anything on. The last step in this process is to create what's called a layer info node, which stores information about the layers that we're painting on to the landscape. What you'll notice is that in the landscape details panel, so I've gone back into landscape mode, and now I'm in paint mode. So if I start painting, nothing visually happens. But now I get this new error message, which says this layer has no layer info assigned yet. You must create or assign a layer info before you can paint this layer. So that's some progress. We're now getting error messages where previously nothing happened. But how do we create a layer info? To do this, what we need to do is in the left-hand side, this paint details panel, at the very bottom, there's a tab called target layers, and under that tab, there's a drop-down menu called layers. And this now, where it previously didn't have anything, this now has those 3 layers that correspond to the 3 layers in my material. And let's just make sure that this works as I am suggesting it does. If I was to create a new layer and call this something like, I don't know, wet mud, isn't it? I guess that's autology. So I'll create a new color node and make this like really brown or something. And I set that to the 4th layer and hit save. Then I now, in this layers panel, that wet mud has miraculously appeared. So the number of layers that you create in this layer blend node corresponds to the number of layers that you see, corresponds exactly to the, to the number of layers that you see in this layers panel in the painting details panel. Okay, but still, again, we're getting this message that says you need a layer info. So next to each of these materials is a little plus button. And if you hover over that, I can use magnifying glass. If you hover over that plus button, you'll get a little message that says create layer info. And that's exactly what we want. So if I hit that, you get an option to create a weight blended or non-weight blended. In most cases, you want weight blended because what you're doing is you're painting on weights to different areas, and you want those weights to blend together naturally. So I'm going to hit weight blended layer, and it's going to ask me where I want to save this layer info. So this layer info exists as an asset in your project. It's already created a shared assets folder for your landscape. So my landscape is currently called Landscape Sculpt Map, and there's a new folder in my project called Shared Assets. So this map is going to have a bunch of shared assets specifically related to the map, and this layer info is one of them. So basically, don't worry about all those words. All the work is pretty much done for you. All you need to do is hit save, accept. Once you do, you'll get an error message if you, like me, have named your thing unsmartly. It says, dark grass contains one of the following invalid characters. And there's just a bunch of characters that you can't use, of which one of which is space. So my layer name has a space in it, which means that I can't save this asset. You could either rename this file if you wanted to, but I think instead what I'm going to do is go back to my layer blend and just make sure that I don't have any spaces in these names. So instead of dark space grass, I'm going to convert this to dark grass. And then the same for light grass. And then I think the other ones are wet mud. So these need to be names without a space. Cool. So once I save that, I should be able to go back to my landscape painting tool, and then under target layers, hit add layer, create weight blended layer, just hit save, and it's all done. And now Unreal has assumed that because this is the first layer, this is going to be the sort of base, the default layer. And if I want other layers, I'll need to paint on top of it. The problem is that just like the dark grass didn't have any layer info attached, none of the other layers have layer info attached at the moment either. So dark grass already has this layer info that we just created, but the other ones don't. So we need to create that layer info for all the other ones as well. So I'm going to create a layer info for the light grass, create one for the sand, and then create one for the wet mud as well. Interesting. Okay, so wet mud didn't save. Okay, so it seems like wet mud is still using the space, which is no drama. All I need to do is remove the space and then hit save. And then that is my 4 layer info assets saved into my project. And you can find those under maps, the name of your level underscore shared assets, and then here are the 4 layer info assets. You don't really need to worry about them, but if you are curious, you can double click and see what information they contain. For the most part, it's stuff that's not at all relevant to this course, but one of the most interesting features that you can add is if you're creating a game and you have physics, so things bouncing around your scene, you can add a physics material to this layer. So instead of just painting on a, let's say, sand versus concrete, you could create a physics material that is very bouncy for concrete and then very not bouncy for sand. And that way you could have different areas of your scene respond to the physics in different ways. But that's not part of what we're doing for this course, so I'm not going to cover it any further than that. All right, now that we have our layer info nodes, what we can do is select any of these layers and simply start painting on. As you can see, sometimes there's a little bit of a processing that happens. If you're beginning to paint onto an area, a section that hasn't been processed before, Unreal can just be like, oh, I need to sort my stuff out. So don't panic if you start painting on and you get a little bit of a checkerboard. That should go away after a little bit of time. But now you can use these different layers to paint on different parts of your scene. So I've got my dark green areas, which is not actually that dark green, my light green areas, and my sand, which I wanted to be my path. So I'll just paint that on there. And then the wet mud, which I will paint on the river, I think. Just like the sculpt tool, there are a number of different options that you have to apply or paint on these colors. So right now, I've just been using the standard paint, which is basically quite intuitive. If you click on a material and then you paint on an area, that material will apply to that area. If you shift click, then just like the sculpt tool, you can remove that layer from that area. Then we've also got the brush fall off and the brush size, as well as the brush type settings, similar to the landscape sculpt tool. So you could paint on a specific pattern if you wanted to. I might need to decrease the scale for that, but you could paint on a specific pattern. Do be aware that what you see here right now is a very, very low resolution sort of rendition of this texture. And that's because we are limited, again, by the quad size. So when we created our new landscape a couple of videos back, we set a scale of 1 meter. So that 1 meter is the limit of resolution of this landscape. So when we paint on a material, we're painting on at a 1 resolution scale. So we can't really get very detailed color information on these landscape layers, but that's okay, because down the line we're not going to be using solid colors, we're going to be using textures, and these textures will blend quite nicely into each other. So at the moment this is looking really low quality and blocky. Don't panic about that, we're definitely going to fix that up. This was more to just show you that you can, if you really wanted to, still use these different brush types rather than the simple circular brush. Next to the paint option, there's also the smooth option, so we can smooth all of these blends together. Do be aware that the smooth look works slightly different. So because I'm currently painting on light grass, if I tried to smooth these two options together, nothing would happen. But let's take this area over here and try and smooth the yellow and the green together. Nothing's going to happen because I'm selecting the wrong layer. I would have to select the sand layer and smooth that, and then that sand layer gets smoothed into the green. So just be aware of that. That's one little catch with the smooth. And then flatten, similar to the way that the flatten in the sculpt tool works. If you click on with sand selected, if I click on somewhere that has sand painted on it already, then that will apply to the rest of where I paint. So if I click on this area where there's no sand and then drag it through, then that sand is now going to be applied. That sand is going to be removed. If I click on an area with full sand and move it into the other part, then that's applied. And then if I click on an area with like some sand, so here the sand's kind of blended in, it will paint that onto the green and also remove, it'll just set that sort of level of sand color throughout. So those three tools together can give you some nice blended colors, materials. And then lastly, noise, very similar to the noise that you've seen before. We can add, subtract both, any material that we select. So you can't really see that because the noise is pretty strong. If it's 8.01 and set the scale to, 32, then this just gives us a slightly more noisy paintbrush, which can be useful for getting a little bit more of an organic blend than something that's super soft. Okay, so that is a super brief overview of setting up the landscape material in such a way that you can create landscape layers on your landscape and paint on those layers in different parts of the landscape. At the moment, we're using simply solid colors, but that's just to demonstrate the sort of general underlying principle. And the next thing that we're going to do is go back to our material and make these materials a little bit more convincing. Before we do that, just one thing to mention. You'll notice that this cube is now black, and that is because anything with our texture on it, let's go back to select mode, anything with our material on it, so this cube still has the landscape layer material on it, but this cube has no landscape layer information. So this cube doesn't have any landscape layer information, and therefore the landscape material is like, I don't know what to do, and it renders black. So make sure that you only apply this material to things that are landscapes and that have that landscape layer information, otherwise they will appear black in your scene. In this case, I'm going to go back to my Megascans and select this material and drag it onto the cube, just so that my cube isn't black, it's more gravelly. Great, that works out fine for me.